I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas. My work and this show is dedicated to educating, validating, elevating, and celebrating the importance of Black fatherhood. This is the Black Fatherhood Podcast. As our next guest writes, fatherhood, while immensely rewarding, comes with its own set of challenges. As a Black father, these challenges are often compounded by societal pressures and stereotypes that can weigh heavily on your shoulders. A new book by our guest aims to provide a sanctuary of positivity, empowerment, and validation amidst these challenges. Kenneth Braswell is a societal entrepreneur, author, and advocate for responsible fatherhood. He is the founder and CEO of Fathers Incorporated, a leading nonprofit championing fatherhood and family wellness. Through innovative programs, speaking engagements, and impactful writing, Braswell empowers fathers across the nation. His books, such as Strength of the Father, Affirmations for Black Dads, tackle diverse facets of fatherhood. Recognized by the OWN Network and the Atlanta Business Chronicle, Braswell's tireless dedication to uplift fathers makes him a transformative figure in promoting responsible fatherhood and mental health. And welcome to the show, Kenneth.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be on the show with you again. I'm privileged to be. This is twice for me. I don't know what to say. And I listen to your podcast all the time, and I don't know if I can count anyone else who's been on twice. So I honor this as a privilege. Thank you so much.
When you have a good guest, you bring them in again because the conversations are always good. So you've been a champion for Black fatherhood for decades. If you could kind of help us understand what led you to this work and why you've made this a focus for your career.
I started, Fathers Incorporated turns 20 years next year. I'm very proud of that and very proud of the work that we've done. But those 20 years only represent 2/3 of my public service. The first 10 years were immersed in being the vice president of the Urban League of New York, being on the boards of the YMCA, Big Brothers and Big Sisters, being a servant of the NAACP and the Urban League, and really immersed in doing this work, trying to figure out how to uplift, particularly Black people in the community that I lived. And during that time, I met a redhead Irish gentleman who was my boss. At that time, I was into my academic background is computer science and accounting. And so go figure, right? But we wrote technical reports and built databases for the state of New York to count New York's housing stock. But Jack had a unique background. He was a anthropologist who studied African American studies, Irish studies, and Native American studies. And Jack's father was a friend to Malcolm X. And Jack would always tell me stories about Malcolm X, and he would talk to me about the conversations that he sat in the living room at their feet listening to. And one day I just had this epiphany, and my mind was like, why does this white man know more about Black people than I do? And so we began to start having those conversations, and he encouraged me to do something about it. He said, you're a writer, stop writing technical manuals and start writing about your experience. And he actually stimulated me to starting a community newspaper called What's Up Newspaper. And that's when I began to move into the community and begin to see more of what he was talking about and help me understand. And as a result of that, here we are 30 years later, and I'm still trying to figure this out. I'm still trying to figure out why it takes so long to get movement, particularly in this space. But I'm dedicated, I'm 10 toes down, and I'm grounded in doing what I can to impact this earth from that perspective.
So I hear that across these, 20 years of work and more than 20 of volunteerism, there's a ton of work that you've done with Black fathers in particular, but with Black communities and communities in general. When you think back across those decades, what was the state of Black fatherhood in America when you started this work, and what does it look like today?
When I started this work 20 years ago, it was very difficult to talk about fatherhood, period.
Mm,
But then to talk about Black fathers, like there wasn't space to
right.
talk about Black fathers. The only thing that we can do is something that we tried doing was really trying to ground what I was talking about in research. Unfortunately, the only research that existed right then was the Moynihan Report.
Uh-huh.
And people had a lot of different reactions to the Moynihan Report, right? And so fast forward almost 20 years, our research institute in Fathers Incorporated is called the Moynihan Institute for Fatherhood Research and Poverty. And I often get the question, why did you call it the Moynihan? And I often also have to say that the report is not named after the man. The report is named after the report, or the
Mm,
institute is named after the report, which is the foundational report that was put out there that speaks and gave us the foundation to everything that we now research after that. And then secondarily, if I would have called it by any prominent African American researcher, you wouldn't take me serious. And
mm.
so I had to create a lightning rod for you to pay attention to me and understand the relevance that I'm trying to bring to the space. And so as it relates to where we are now, I think that we have moved the needle. That people now somewhat understand that fathers are essential, not optional. That we do bring our own unique experiences to the family paradigm, that children do need us as much as we need moms. I think moving forward, what we're going to have to understand is how do we individually serve the needs of children, moms, and dads in a collective way. Because right now, I think we do it in silos and we haven't figured out how to do that in a collective way.
I totally agree with you. I think we've even when we think of the family system, by default we're thinking of mother and child. And the father comes in as a person who meets certain roles, but not as an integral part of that family. So he comes in as a financial provider. He comes in as a protector. He comes in as a whatever else you might have him come in as. But he's not seen as a critical or essential part of that family, and more so for Black families. The assumption is that the assumption is not just that Black fathers aren't involved and aren't present. The assumption is that they should not be.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely. And
I
they
want
should
people
not
to
be.
understand the difference between the assumption being that they are not, and the assumption, policy-wise and otherwise, that they should not be involved in their children's lives or in their families' lives.
I stumbled upon a documentary the other day and have been deep in this documentary, keep rewinding it and watching it over and over again. And I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he's a Harvard grad. The documentary is called Who Are We? A Chronicle of Racism in America. And what he's doing in this documentary, he's taking 2 hours, it's grounded in Memphis, and he is actually building the foundation and helping you understand the foundation of where racism began, how it has permeated over these years, and why it is what it is today. But when he got to the end, he said, you know, none of what happened back then is anybody's fault today. But to understand white privilege is to understand that we want you to recognize that just because we want you to recognize who we are doesn't mean that we're taking anything from you. And I oftentimes think about that as it relates to this fatherhood work, right? That we get in these conversations and people want to position this conversation as if we do anything for fathers, we're taking something from mom. But no one thinks of it as if we're working with dads and we're working with moms, we're giving something to the children. Like it doesn't, the conversation doesn't go that far. And we got to begin to start having these conversations where empowerment is great. Empowerment is essential. Empowerment is needed for both Black fathers and Black mothers. But if we don't recognize in tandem that the collective work that we have to do with each other is important to our system beyond our own selfish nature to be better than the other, we're never going to get where we need to be.
I appreciate you for sharing that. And I want to segue into something related to that, and that is to center the fact that in the midst of all of this work, you are a father.
Yes.
And you've dedicated your book to your children, specifically to your son, your daughters, and your nephew. Mm-hmm. We've spoken a great deal on this show about fathers who aren't biological fathers, but fathers nonetheless. Tell us a little bit about your experience as a father and your role as a father to your nephew.
I'm still trying to figure it out. And so God did something very interesting to me, which is he gave me 4 girls first, and I had to raise 4 girls. And then our surprise blessing, which is our son, who is now 14 years old, came into my life. COVID dropped more than just the chaos of what COVID dropped on us. But in the mix of that is when our nephew moved in with us, because he was a latchkey kid in a house with his single mom who was a first responder. And so he was home just doing nothing, because they had not figured that out. And I was like, you know what? He needs to be somewhere where he can be surrounded by folks that will allow him to kind of nurture. And so it took us some elbow twisting, and finally she allowed him to come down here with us. And he has now, gone from, being a CD student in Albany to being an AB student in Atlanta and just making the basketball team. And he has no desire to want to go back home. Now, I don't know how I feel about that, right? Because that's your mother. I'm trying to understand, why is it that you don't want to go back? But that's a conversation for another day.
Right.
But what it has done for me, it has allowed me to be able to do this work of responsible fatherhood and focus on the fact and the necessity of fathers being engaged in the lives of children and youth, period, right? No matter what it looks like. Some weeks ago, a month or so ago, we lost Richard Roundtree. And when I saw that, my heart sunk. And it's not because of his career. It is because as a young African-American male growing up in Brooklyn, New York, I had 2 examples of fathers, and neither one of them were my biological father, and neither one of them was a stepfather. It was John Amos, who played James Evans on Good Time, and Richard Roundtree, who played John Shaft on Shaft. Those were the boundaries to which I thought fathers should exist, even though Richard Roundtree did not have children. He was still respectable of, in some instances, women in Shaft, not all instances, but there's these moments that they showed that he had the ability to have compassion for women in that movie. And he also showed compassion for children in some of those scenes. And to me, that was important in 1971 to show in the middle of Black exploitation movies that you can be, quote unquote, super bad or super fly, right? And still be conscious about the responsibility that you have for children. So for my nephew, it is today as a result of those 2 examples, and then the examples that I've come to learn and know over the course of the last 30 years or so, that my responsibility is to my family, regardless of what the nature of your affiliation is with me. Right. And so that the ultimate goal for me and my nephew is to make him feel necessary, to make him feel loved, to make him feel empowered, and give him the same ability that I give my son. And that is the ability to be anything you want with as least obstacles as possible that I can provide to you by the opportunities that I could give you and the modeling of behavior.
I love the fact that you've pulled in quite a few examples and archetypes of fathers, including your own father, yourself, Richard Roundtree, John Amos, and others. Tell us a little bit, if you can, about the relationship that you had with your father and what you learned from him that you carry on today, or what you learned that you may not want to carry on today as you father your daughters, as you father your nephew, as you think about engaging and supporting Black fathers?
I used to start off a lot of my keynote addresses with, I'm not just the CEO, but I'm also a client. If it wasn't for this work, I would have never discovered my father. Because I kept trying to figure out what's the driving force. When I flipped from doing the other work that I was doing in the 10 years to shifting, there was a lot of circumstances that kind of moved me into thinking about fatherhood. But now I understand clearly why I was shifted in that space. But I'm actually writing my memoir now. I just started writing my memoir. And the memoir is going to be entitled Echoes of My Father. And the reason that I'm calling it that is because whether or not, let me rephrase that. Both the absence and the presence of your father leaves echoes in your life. Malik Yoba helped me understand that. He's writing his book memoir about his life, and it starts off talking about his dad. And he said to me, Ken, he's like, my assistant said to me, Malik, do you know that oftentimes when you're talking about something, you always pull in wisdom for your father? You always talk about how you didn't have a great relationship with him, but you're always pulling in anecdotes from your father. And he said he had never realized that before. And so when he was telling me about the book, I said, who's writing the foreword? And he says, oh, glad you asked. He says, because I'd really like you to take a shot at writing the foreword for my memoir. So he sent me like the first 5 or 6 chapters. And when I read it, what I kept hearing was his father showing up in all of these different spaces. And when I kept hearing that and seeing that, I was like, those are echoes. Like those are, if you invoke something as a result of trying to pull attention to yourself, that noise is going to echo back at you. And it doesn't always sound the same way you put it out, but it's going to come back the same way with the same tone. And so as a result of that, it was like, I started thinking about all the times in my life that my father's, both more his absence, but his little tiny bit of presence had a very strong impact on areas of my life that I never knew it was him. I never knew the reason that I did things was because of him. I never knew the reasons that I dug so deep into family and wanted to be a healthy husband and wanted to be an impactful father and wanted to be a community servant. Was all these things my dad were unknowing to me, right? And then when my mother finally told me at 53 years old that it wasn't my father that left, it was her family that ran him away and made her move from North Carolina to New York City so that she can raise me on her own, gave me a whole nother narrative about him, which is why I always tell people who have this visceral anger about their fathers, tame yourself or temper yourself until you know the whole story.
The whole story, yeah.
Because you don't know the whole story. Not everybody just leaves because they don't want to be there. There's always a circumstance to which you have to address. Now, the circumstance might not be right, but at least understand the circumstance itself. And so for me, he was part of, or he is part of, why I continue to press so hard in this space, because I don't want the absent echoes to be the overarching noise and voice that young children hear from their father. It's got to be the voice of the present father that they hear, not the absent father that they hear.
Yeah. I really love that reflection. And what I'm hoping is that more persons like yourself will write books that explore their relationship with their father and makes it a more common conversation. Maybe some of the young rappers, some of the young musicians, young artists will also pick this up and spend some time listening to this podcast and other podcasts like yours that talk about fatherhood, and spend some time kind of exploring their father experiences, exploring their relationship with their father. And out of that create work that highlights fathers, the struggle of fatherhood. Maybe somebody will put out an album that has a full list of songs just about fatherhood and the challenges of fatherhood. But going into your book, you focus on improving the mental health of Black fathers, and you provide a series of affirmations. We'll spend some time talking about some of these affirmations. We won't go through all of them because we want people to go to the book itself and get all of them. But we'll pull a few of them, and we'll talk about some of those affirmations and what they mean. So each chapter in the book provides a series of affirmations that challenge the reader to answer some reflective questions about the affirmation. So let's take a look at a few of those. One of those that I liked was self-love. So I'll read the affirmation and the reflective question, and then have you kind of talk to us and kind of help us reflect on how you came up with this and what you mean people to get out of this. So on self-love affirmation is, I honor the essence of who I am, understanding that I am a beacon of strength, love, and wisdom for my children. And the question you ask us to reflect on regarding that is, what unique qualities do I bring to my fatherhood role or to my role as father? And how do these qualities impact my children?
The first chapter for me on self-love was really the reason that I wanted to write the book in the first place, right? Because across the workspace of responsible fatherhood, one of our biggest challenges is to frame the conversation of responsible fatherhood from a asset perspective, because we are always trying to pull on heartstrings by pointing to the liability perspectives of fathers. And one of what I've learned over the last 20 years and over the tens of thousands of fathers that we have served and the fathers that we are now serving here in Metro Atlanta, that the biggest challenge that our fathers have in their journey of fatherhood is recognizing their own self-worth. And so they spend more time speaking negative about themselves or not speaking at all to themselves, that no one has said to them, it starts with you. Speaking positivity into yourself starts when you wake up in the morning and you look in the mirror. Don't just spend time in the mirror to fix your mask, to display the man you want everybody to see, but work on the man on the inside that you want everybody to feel, because that's how they're going to recognize you. So that particular affirmation was about recognize your strengths. Don't dismiss your strengths. Speak to your strengths. Understand that you bring something significant to the space and act on those things. I talk about, and I'll end here on this one because this one is my most passionate chapter, the self-love thing. And I often say to folks, there's a reason that the Amazing Spider-Man is called amazing. And I said, don't you think that Spider-Man knows he's amazing? Yeah, in most occasions, he probably does. But there's some mornings that he gets up and he's Peter Parker and he doesn't feel so amazing. And someone has to tell him he's amazing in order to motivate him to go back out into the world and do the things that he's amazing for. Why would we have to call the Hulk incredible? Don't we know that the Hulk is incredible? But some mornings he wakes up as Bruce Banner and he's walking the highways and byways because he's scared of what his strength may do. He's petrified that his strength may hurt somebody. Think about that as a dad. That's what they do when they don't speak to themselves. And so if you wake up in the morning and say to yourself, I am both incredible and amazing, it changes your perspective A, on how you see yourself, but B, on how people see you. And that's why the self-love portion of being a Black man slash Black father, because there's a different aspects of both of those two things that you have to speak to yourself about before you walk out the door, right? That empowers you to be able to bring your full self to the table.
So I was going to go down a different lane, but having spoken about that and about the amazingness or awesomeness and the incredibleness and the strength, I want to talk about emotional intelligence, because that's a space that we often don't talk about with men, and we see it as a sign of weakness. But your affirmation for emotional intelligence on page 66 says, I embrace the full spectrum of my emotions, knowing that they make me a compassionate father. And the reflective question is, how can I encourage my children to embrace their own emotions?
By displaying emotions, right? And so my entire family will tell you that my dad is a crier, right? I've seen him cry at funerals. I've seen him cry in the middle of his speaking. I've seen him cry watching commercials, right? I've seen him cry while he's driving and listening to a podcast, right? And so there is no area of my life that says to me that my dad doesn't love me, because he says it all the time. There's no absence from my boys of my dad saying, I'm proud of you, because he says it all the time. So when you express the ability to manage emotions as a man and then as a dad, it gives your children the ability to be able to do it, but the acceptance that it's okay to be emotional, right? To recognize when you're being driven by an emotion. That's what my father did in my life, because I had to realize that anger was an emotion, but anger is a secondary emotion. That anyone who's angry, you first have to ask them, what are you angry about? And it's usually the thing that will tell you why they're angry in the first place. So I've had to be able to build that skill in myself to be able to know what emotion I'm dealing with and what's triggering that emotion, and deal with the thing that's triggering it, as opposed to the emotion itself. And sometimes I do that privately within my own self, and sometimes I do it out loud. Sometimes, like if I'm in a car, and I'm not a road rage guy, but if somebody does something crazy, it's kind of hard not to say something, right? And some expletives may come out with the children in the car, and I'll say like, my goodness, sometimes you just gotta be in a space where folks will do something crazy in front of you, and you have to express yourself in a way that allows you to relieve yourself of the emotion, but not let that emotion turn into an act that puts my family in danger. Right. So I can't stomp on the gas when somebody does it with my kids in the car, to cut the person off 15 lights down, to jump out the car and start yelling and screaming at him, knowing that my kids are in the car and not knowing who I'm approaching in the car when I do that. Right. That's being able to manage your emotions and display a great, healthy behavior of the emotions that you do have.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, Kenneth. This is just bursting at the seams with all kinds of gems and awesomeness. Please go get that book, Strength of the Father, Affirmations for Black Dads. If this is any indication of what you can get from this book, I hope every man and everybody who has a man that they love in their life, whether it be your child, grandchild, whatever, please get them this book, because there's just so much really great fodder for introspection and finding one's self. But I will ask you one question before we end.
Mm-hmm.
Given all that you've experienced, given all that you've written, given all that you hope to continue to do, what advice would you give to young Black fathers today?
Don't miss a minute, because if you miss a minute, you'll miss a moment. And sometimes those moments can't be recovered. Don't hate the mother of your child more than you love your children, because it's in that you miss minutes, and as a result of that, you miss moments.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Fathers are not optional. They are essential, I think, is probably one of the biggest takeaways. It is a father's responsibility, necessity, to make their children feel necessary, feel loved, empowered, and to make sure that there are as few obstacles as possible between their child and their child's ultimate purpose. Use everything that you have to build your child. Don't miss any opportunities to strengthen your child, to uplift your child, to support your child. If you miss a minute, you may have missed an opportunity. You may have missed a moment to make the essential impact that your child may need. What's in your hand? Music, writing, speech, art, sport, whatever is in your hand, use it to do that work of creating, of strengthening, of supporting not just your child and your family, but your community. And as fathers, prepare to do this difficult work, this heavy lift of supporting their children and their families. Spend time also in reflecting on your own life and how you've come to be and your own fatherhood experiences. In a previous episode with Esau McCauley, connecting now with Kenneth Braswell, we understand the need to understand the full story of presence and absence of fathers. And once the full story has come out, to lean on forgiveness and grace as a way to emotional freedom, your emotional freedom, to better mental health, your better mental health, to an appreciation of self. For it is in appreciating one's self that you're able to appreciate others. Love on your children and appreciate the gift that they are. You've been listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and the director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva. Our series producer is Joe Ruby. The podcast is supported by the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758. That's Dr_AT758. And on the web at thomaslab.humanecology.wisc.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the Black Fatherhood Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.